London, 1813. Miss Cordelia Ashworth clutched her reticule, containing every penny she possessed, as the auctioneer presented the Celestine diamond necklace. For 11 years she had searched for her grandmother's stolen treasure, sold by her gambling father when she was 15. Now, seated in the third row of Whitmore and Associates' auction house, she faced her greatest obstacle yet. The Earl of Ravenscroft lounged in the front row, his casual elegance masking ruthless determination. As the bidding war escalated, their eyes met across the crowded room. Neither knew that this collision of wills would lead to the most scandalous gesture London society had ever witnessed, transforming a simple auction into a battle for love, pride, and redemption that would change both their lives forever. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. The morning air in London carried the scent of coal smoke and possibility as carriages rattled through the cobbled streets toward Whitmore and Associates, the most prestigious auction house in Mayfair. Inside the elegant establishment, with its polished mahogany paneling and crystal chandeliers, society's elite gathered for what promised to be the season's most spectacular sale. Miss Cordelia Ashworth adjusted her modest blue pelisse as she settled into her seat in the third row, her fingers unconsciously tightening around the worn leather of her reticule. The small bag contained £120, every shilling she possessed in the world, painstakingly saved over 5 long years from her meager allowance and the small legacy her dear mother had left her. To any observer, she appeared the picture of composure, her dark hair neatly arranged beneath a simple bonnet, her posture erect despite the plainness of her attire. Yet beneath this calm exterior, her heart thundered with anticipation and dread. Today, after 11 years of searching, tracking, and hoping, she would finally have the chance to reclaim what had been stolen from her. The Celestine diamond necklace was no mere piece of jewelry to Cordelia. It had belonged to her beloved grandmother, the Countess of Ashworth, a woman of remarkable character who had raised Cordelia after her mother's early death. The necklace, with its intricate setting of diamonds arranged like celestial stars, had been a symbol of love, heritage, and the strength that ran through the women of their family. When her father, in one of his countless fits of gambling fever, had sold it to pay his mounting debts, 15-year-old Cordelia had felt as though her very heart had been torn from her chest. Now, at 26, she was no longer the helpless girl who could only weep as her heritage disappeared into the hands of strangers. She had spent years learning the necklace's whereabouts, following its trail through various owners, waiting for the moment when it would surface again at auction, where she might have a chance to reclaim it. In the front row of the auction house, Marcus Blackwood, the 5th Earl of Ravenscroft, settled into his seat with the casual elegance that marked everything he did. At 32, he possessed the kind of commanding presence that drew attention without effort, his tall frame impeccably dressed in a coat of midnight blue that complemented his dark hair and penetrating grey eyes. Society whispered that he was the most eligible bachelor in England, a man of vast fortune and impeccable lineage who could have his choice of any woman in the ton. Yet Marcus remained stubbornly unmarried, much to the frustration of countless mothers with marriageable daughters. His interest in the Celestine diamond necklace stemmed not from any personal attachment to jewelry, but from a calculated desire to please Lady Margot Sinclair, the acknowledged diamond of the current season. Lady Margot, with her golden hair and porcelain beauty, represented everything society expected in a countess. She was well-bred, accomplished, and possessed of the kind of cool elegance that would complement his position perfectly. Their eventual marriage was considered such a foregone conclusion that the betting books at White's no longer accepted wagers on the subject. The necklace, Marcus had decided, would serve as both a betrothal gift and a statement of his intentions. As he waited for the auction to begin, he found his attention wandering to the other attendees, noting the familiar faces of collectors and the hopeful expressions of those seeking bargains. His gaze passed over a young woman in the third row, noting only that her modest dress seemed out of place among the more elaborate costumes surrounding her. Little did he know that this unremarkable woman would soon prove to be his most formidable opponent. Mr. Theodore Whitmore, the auction house's proprietor, took his position at the podium with the practiced confidence of a man who had overseen countless sales of precious objects. The murmur of conversation gradually died away as he raised his gavel, his keen eyes surveying the assembled crowd. Today's sale featured numerous valuable items, but everyone present knew that the true prize was the necklace that would be presented near the end of the proceedings. Whitmore had deliberately scheduled it thus, allowing anticipation to build throughout the afternoon. When the moment finally arrived, two assistants carefully carried forth a velvet-lined case, opening it to reveal the Celestine diamond necklace in all its glory. Even in the afternoon light filtering through the tall windows, the diamonds caught and reflected the illumination with breathtaking brilliance, each stone perfectly cut to enhance the overall effect. A collective intake of breath swept through the room as spectators leaned forward to better admire the piece. Cordelia felt tears prick her eyes as she gazed upon the necklace for the first time in Elfontov's years. It was exactly as she remembered, yet somehow even more beautiful than her memory had preserved. She could almost see her grandmother wearing it, feel the gentle touch of aged hands as the old countess had allowed young Cordelia to examine each diamond, telling her stories of the necklace's history and the love it represented. The sight of it now, so close yet still beyond her reach, filled her with a complex mixture of joy and anguish that threatened to overwhelm her carefully maintained composure. The bidding began at £50, and immediately several hands shot up around the room. Cordelia waited, her palms growing damp inside her gloves as she watched the price climb steadily. At £60 retentions, she tentatively raised her hand, her voice barely audible as she called out her bid. She felt rather than saw heads turn in her direction, surprised by this unknown participant in what was clearly becoming a high-stakes competition. Marcus noticed her bid with mild curiosity, wondering what interest this plainly dressed woman could have in such an expensive piece. At £70, he entered the bidding with casual authority, his deep voice carrying easily through the room as he increased the amount to 75 dirham. The bidding continued to escalate, and Cordelia found herself caught in a duel with the elegant gentleman in the front row, though she could not see his face clearly from her position. At £80, several other bidders withdrew, recognizing that the competition had become too rich for their blood. At £90, Cordelia's heart began to race as she approached the limit of her resources. When the bidding reached £100, she felt a moment of despair, knowing she was approaching the edge of her ability to continue. The gentleman in front bid £110 with an air of finality, as though he expected this to end the matter. It was then that Cordelia did something that surprised even herself. Rising to her feet, her voice clear and strong despite her inner turmoil, she declared, £120. The words rang through the suddenly silent auction room like a clarion call, and every head turned to stare at this audacious woman who dared challenge what appeared to be a gentleman of considerable means. Marcus turned in his seat to get a better look at his unexpected opponent, and what he saw gave him pause. The woman stood with quiet dignity despite the attention focused upon her, her chin raised in a gesture of defiance that spoke of inner strength rather than mere stubbornness. Her face, while not conventionally beautiful, possessed a quality of intelligence and character that was far more arresting than mere prettiness. Most intriguing of all was the expression in her dark eyes as she gazed at the necklace, a look of such longing and desperate hope that it suggested this was far more than a simple desire for jewelry. Something about her bearing, the set of her shoulders, and the quiet desperation masked by dignity gave him unexpected pause. Marcus found himself studying her with growing fascination, noting the modest quality of her dress that nevertheless could not diminish the natural grace of her bearing. There was something in her manner that spoke of breeding and education, despite her obvious reduced circumstances. Most puzzling of all was the intensity of her desire for this particular piece. He had seen collectors and connoisseurs pursue objects they coveted, but this woman's attachment seemed to run deeper than mere aesthetic appreciation or investment potential. As the auctioneer called for any further bids, Marcus realized he could easily outbid her. His wealth was sufficient to purchase the necklace 10 times over without causing him any financial strain. Yet something held him back, some instinct he could not quite name that made him reluctant to crush this woman's obvious hopes. The moment stretched taut with tension as the entire room waited to see whether the mysterious gentleman would continue the bidding. When Whitmore called going once, going twice, Marcus remained silent, his eyes fixed on the woman who had so unexpectedly captured his attention. The fall of the gavel seemed to echo through the stunned silence as Whitmore declared, "Sold to the lady in blue." Cordelia's hands trembled as she made her way to the payment desk, her legs unsteady beneath her as the magnitude of what she had just accomplished began to sink in. She had done it! After 11 years of patient searching and saving, her grandmother's necklace would finally come home. The transaction nearly emptied her purse, leaving her with barely enough for her immediate needs. But she found she cared nothing for such practical concerns. As she clutched the precious case containing the necklace, she became aware of a tall figure approaching her through the crowd. Marcus Blackwood moved with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to having his way in the world, his grey eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her suddenly self-conscious. When he stopped before her and executed a perfect bow, she realized with some alarm that this was the gentleman she had outbid, the man whose obvious wealth and position should have made him her superior in any competition. "You seem remarkably attached to this particular necklace, miss," he began, his voice carrying the cultured tones of the aristocracy. "Ashworth," she replied, meeting his gaze with as much composure as she could muster. "And yes, my lord, I am." The slight emphasis on his title made it clear that she had recognized his elevated status despite not knowing his specific identity. "Might I ask why?" he continued, genuinely curious about what could drive a woman of modest means to spend such a sum on jewelry. "You might ask," she replied with quiet dignity, lifting her chin slightly in a gesture that reminded him oddly of a queen addressing a subject. "Whether I choose to answer is another matter entirely." Her direct manner, so different from the simpering flattery or calculated charm he usually encountered from women, both intrigued and frustrated him. Here was someone who treated him not as a prize to be won or a fortune to be pursued, but simply as a man whose questions she might or might not choose to acknowledge. Marcus Blackwood stood at the tall windows of his study, watching the rain streak down the glass as the first grey light of dawn crept across London's rooftops. Sleep had eluded him entirely, his mind returning again and again to the mysterious Miss Ashworth and the expression that had crossed her face when she held that necklace. There had been something profound in that moment, a depth of emotion he rarely witnessed in the calculated world of society. Most women of his acquaintance viewed jewelry as mere adornment or status symbols, but for Miss Ashworth, that particular piece had clearly held significance far beyond its monetary value. The memory haunted him. The way her fingers had trembled slightly as she clutched the case to her chest, the brief moment when her carefully composed mask had slipped to reveal something raw and vulnerable beneath. He had dispatched his secretary, Mr. Harrison, the previous evening with instructions to discover everything possible about Miss Cordelia Ashworth and her connection to the Celestine diamond necklace. The report, delivered just after midnight, had proven both illuminating and deeply troubling. The necklace had indeed belonged to her grandmother, the late Lady Margaret Ashworth, wife to the previous Baron Ashworth. When the current Baron, Miss Ashworth's father, had inherited both title and crushing debts 11 years prior, he had systematically sold off everything of value to satisfy his creditors and fund his continued gambling. The necklace had been among the first items to go, sold privately to a collector who had eventually consigned it to Whitmore's auction house. Miss Ashworth herself lived in reduced circumstances in modest lodgings near Russell Square, her only companion an elderly widow named Mrs. Pemberton, who served as her chaperone. They survived on a pittance, the remainder of a small inheritance from her grandmother that her father had somehow failed to squander. The image of this proud, dignified woman carefully hoarding every penny for 5 long years, denying herself even basic comforts in pursuit of recovering a treasured family heirloom, stirred something deep within Marcus's chest that he had thought long dead. Here was someone who understood the true value of things, who valued love and memory over mere wealth or position. The contrast with his usual social circle, where everything was calculated for advantage and nothing held sentimental worth, struck him with unexpected force. By the time his valet, James, appeared with hot shaving water and the morning papers, Marcus had reached a decision that surprised even himself. James, a man of middle years who had served the Blackwood family since Marcus was a boy, raised a questioning eyebrow at his master's unusually early rising and the determined set to his jaw, but knew better than to comment directly. Instead, he simply inquired, "My lord, shall I have the carriage brought round at the usual time?" To which Marcus replied with uncharacteristic abruptness, "No, James. Have it ready within the hour. I have business to attend to that cannot wait." The streets of London's commercial district bustled with early morning activity as Marcus's elegant black carriage drew up outside Whitmore and Associates. The Earl rarely ventured into this part of the city, preferring to conduct his business affairs from the comfort of his study or his clubs, but today felt different, charged with an energy he couldn't quite name. Mr. Theodore Whitmore, a man of perhaps 50 years, with prematurely grey hair and shrewd brown eyes, was just unlocking the front door of his establishment when Marcus approached. The jeweller's surprise at seeing one of England's most prominent peers on his doorstep at such an early hour was evident, though he quickly composed himself and offered a deep bow. "Your lordship," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "To what do I owe this unexpected pleasure?" Though Marcus detected a note of wariness beneath the polite words, Mr. Whitmore had undoubtedly heard about yesterday's unusual bidding war and wondered what new complications the Earl's presence might bring. Marcus wasted no time on pleasantries. His decision crystallized into unwavering resolve during the short carriage ride. "Mr. Whitmore," he began without preamble, "I wish to make you an offer for your establishment." The jeweller's eyebrows rose in genuine surprise as he ushered Marcus into the shop's elegant showroom, where morning light streaming through tall windows caught the facets of countless gems and sent rainbow reflections dancing across the walls. "An offer, my lord," Whitmore repeated carefully, his merchant's instincts immediately alert. "Might I inquire what sort of offer you have in mind?" To which Marcus replied with the same directness he brought to all his business dealings, though this particular transaction felt anything but routine. "I wish to purchase your entire operation, Mr. Whitmore. The building, the inventory, the name, the reputation, everything associated with Whitmore and Associates." The silence that followed stretched for several long moments as the jeweller attempted to process this extraordinary proposal, his mind clearly racing through the implications and possibilities. Finally, he found his voice, though it carried a note of bewilderment that he couldn't quite suppress. "Your lordship, forgive me, but I must ask, why would a gentleman of your position wish to own a jewelry establishment, particularly when you show no interest in the trade itself?" The question was reasonable, even expected. Yet Marcus found himself reluctant to examine his own motivations too closely, knowing that what had begun as a simple impulse to right a perceived wrong had somehow evolved into something far more complex and personal. "That," he replied with the authority of a man accustomed to having his wishes respected without question, "is my concern alone, Mr. Whitmore. I require only that you name a fair price for everything you possess here." The negotiation that followed was swift and decisive, conducted with the efficiency that Marcus brought to all his commercial ventures, though Whitmore's obvious confusion at the entire proceeding added an element of surrealism to the transaction. The jeweler named a sum that was substantial but fair, reflecting both the value of his inventory and the goodwill built up over decades of honest dealing. And Marcus accepted without hesitation or attempt to bargain, instructing his banker to transfer the funds immediately. Within 2 hours of entering the shop, Marcus found himself the owner of a complete jewelry establishment, a situation so unprecedented that word of it spread through London's commercial district like wildfire, generating speculation and amazement in equal measure. As he signed the final documents and accepted the keys to his new property, Marcus couldn't help but wonder what Miss Ashworth would make of this development, though he suspected she would view his gesture with the same mixture of suspicion and stubborn pride that seemed to characterize her approach to most things. The following morning found Cordelia Ashworth returning from her customary early walk through the quieter streets near her lodgings, a routine that provided her with both necessary exercise and a brief respite from the confines of her modest rooms. The morning air carried the familiar scents of coal smoke and freshly baked bread from the nearby shops, and she had been looking forward to a quiet breakfast with Mrs. Pemberton before beginning her usual round of small economies and careful planning that comprised her daily existence. However, as she rounded the corner onto Grosvenor Place, she stopped short at an extraordinary sight that made her question whether she might still be dreaming. Her modest lodging-house, which usually stood quietly unremarkable among its neighbours, was surrounded by a small army of liveried servants, elegant carriages and wagons laden with mysterious cargo covered by pristine white sheets. "Bitcooked." Pemberton stood in the doorway clutching what appeared to be an official document, her normally composed elderly face pale with shock and confusion, while several imposing footmen waited respectfully nearby as if seeking further instructions. Cordelia approached cautiously, her mind racing through possible explanations for this unprecedented disturbance, though none seemed remotely plausible given their humble circumstances and lack of wealthy connections. Mrs. Pemberton, who had served as her chaperone and companion for the past 3 years with unfailing discretion and kindness, looked up at her approach with an expression of such bewilderment that Cordelia felt her own anxiety increase exponentially. "My dear Cordelia," the older woman said in a voice barely above a whisper, "you must see this immediately. I fear I cannot make sense of it at all." With trembling fingers, she extended the document, which Cordelia could see bore the distinctive watermark and seal of the highest quality stationery, though the significance of these details would not become clear until she read the contents. The letter itself was brief but staggering in its implications, written in a bold, masculine hand on paper that proclaimed its author's elevated status through every fibre. And as Cordelia read the few lines, she felt the world shift beneath her feet in a way that reminded her uncomfortably of that terrible day 11 years ago when her father had announced the sale of her grandmother's jewelry. "Miss Ashworth," the letter began with formal courtesy, "I find myself with a jewelry establishment I have no use for. As you demonstrated superior judgment in your recent acquisition, I believe you are better qualified to oversee such an enterprise. Please accept Whitmore and Associates as a token of my admiration for your discernment." The signature, executed with the confident flourish of a man accustomed to having his every word carry weight, read simply Ravenscroft, though the implications of that single name were anything but simple. Accompanying the letter were the actual deeds to the Whitmore establishment, complete inventory lists written in a careful clerk's hand that detailed every item from the most precious diamonds to the humblest pins, and a substantial bank draft drawn on one of London's most prestigious banking houses, sufficient to cover months of operating expenses for the entire business. Cordelia stared at these documents with emotions that warred between gratitude, suspicion, and the overwhelming sense of unreality, her practical mind struggling to comprehend the magnitude of what was being offered, while her heart whispered warnings about the dangers of accepting such extraordinary generosity from a virtual stranger. "What manner of man gives away a jewelry shop?" she asked aloud, her voice carrying a note of desperate bewilderment as she looked from the papers to Mrs. Pemberton and back again, searching for some rational explanation that might make sense of this impossible situation, to which her companion replied with the dark wisdom of a woman who had observed society's machinations for 7 decades. "One who wants something in return, my dear, and I fear we must be very careful indeed about what that something might be." The morning sun cast long shadows through the tall windows of Cordelia's modest sitting room as she paced before the fireplace, the Earl's letter crumpled in her hand, and her mind spinning with the impossibility of what she had just read. Mrs. Pemberton sat quietly in her favorite chair, her shrewd eyes following Cordelia's agitated movements, while the servants waited outside for instructions regarding the mysterious cargo that had appeared with the dawn. The very idea of accepting such an extravagant gift from a gentleman she barely knew sent waves of mortification through Cordelia's already battered pride. Yet the practical implications of refusing it seemed equally daunting. Her first impulse, born of years of careful propriety and acute awareness of her vulnerable position in society, was to refuse the gift immediately and return everything to the Earl with a polite but firm letter expressing her gratitude while declining his extraordinary generosity. The scandal that would inevitably follow any unmarried lady accepting such largesse from a gentleman of rank was precisely the sort of notoriety that could destroy what little reputation she still possessed, rendering her completely unmarriageable and casting shadows over her character that might never fully lift. Yet as she considered the servants waiting patiently outside and thought of the Whitmore establishment with its elegant showrooms and carefully curated inventory, another consideration began to intrude upon her righteous indignation. Mr. Whitmore had been in business for over 30 years, building his reputation on honest dealing and superior craftsmanship, and such an enterprise surely employed numerous individuals whose livelihoods depended upon its continued operation. The thought of these innocent people suffering because of her pride, and the Earl's incomprehensible gesture weighed heavily upon her conscience, for she had learned through her own reduced circumstances how quickly financial security could disappear, and how difficult it was to rebuild once lost. Unable to bear the uncertainty any longer, Cordelia made the decision that would alter the course of her life irrevocably. "Mrs. Pemberton," she announced with more confidence than she felt, "I must visit the shop immediately to understand the full scope of what has been placed in my care before I can make any rational decision about how to proceed." Her companion nodded approvingly. For despite her earlier warnings about the Earl's possible motivations, she recognized that Cordelia's practical nature would never allow her to make such a momentous choice without full knowledge of its implications. Within the hour, they had hired a hackney carriage and made their way through London's busy streets to the elegant establishment that bore the Whitmore name, where Cordelia's first sight of the shop's grandeur nearly robbed her of breath entirely. The Whitmore establishment occupied a prime location in one of London's most fashionable districts, its large windows displaying jewelry that caught and reflected the morning light in dazzling arrays of color and brilliance. As Cordelia approached the front door, she could see through the glass several employees moving about their daily tasks. Arranging displays and consulting with early customers, their faces showing no awareness that their very employment might hang in the balance of her decision. Mr. Theodore Whitmore himself greeted her at the door with a deep bow that carried genuine respect rather than mere courtesy, his manner suggesting that he had been expecting her arrival and was prepared to provide whatever information she might require. "Miss Ashworth," he said with evident relief, "I confess I hoped you might visit today, for there are many matters we should discuss regarding your new responsibilities." The word responsibilities struck Cordelia with particular force, for it implied an acceptance of the Earl's gift that she had not yet formally made, yet she allowed herself to be guided into the shop's interior where she could better appreciate the magnitude of what was being offered. The main showroom was even more impressive than she had imagined, with glass cases containing pieces that represented the finest work of master craftsmen, from delicate earrings suitable for young ladies making their debuts to elaborate necklaces that would grace the throats of duchesses at court presentations. Mr. Whitmore gestured toward a smaller room behind the main display area, where he conducted his most important business, and as they settled into comfortable chairs, surrounded by samples of his finest work, he began to explain the unusual circumstances that had led to this moment. "His lordship's instructions were quite specific, Miss Ashworth," the jeweler said, with the careful precision of a man who had spent decades dealing with the eccentricities of wealthy clients. "You are to have complete authority over all operations of this establishment, from the selection of inventory to the hiring and dismissal of staff, and he wants absolutely no involvement whatsoever in the daily management of the business." When Cordelia asked whether the Earl had explained his reasons for such an extraordinary arrangement, Mr. Whitmore simply shook his head with a slight smile that suggested he had long ago learned not to question the motivations of his aristocratic clientele. What he could tell her was that the business employed 23 individuals, from the skilled craftsmen who created custom pieces in the workshop behind the shop, to the young women who served customers in the showroom, all of whom depended upon steady employment to support themselves and their families. The weight of this responsibility settled upon Cordelia's shoulders like a heavy cloak, for she realized that her decision would affect far more lives than simply her own. Despite every instinct that warned her against accepting such a compromising gift, Cordelia found herself agreeing to take temporary stewardship of the business, telling herself that she would find some way to either return it to the Earl or ensure the employees' security without damaging her own reputation beyond repair. The decision felt both inevitable and terrifying, as though she were stepping onto a path that would lead her far from the quiet, unremarkable life she had carefully constructed for herself in the years since her father's disgrace. When word of her acceptance reached Marcus through the network of informants and gossips that made London society function like a vast, interconnected web of information, his reaction was a complex mixture of pleasure and frustration that surprised him with its intensity. He had hoped that his gesture might serve as an opening for further communication between them, perhaps leading to the kind of friendship that could gradually develop into something deeper. Yet Miss Ashworth continued to maintain a careful distance that suggested she viewed his gift with suspicion rather than gratitude. All business communications came through intermediaries, either Mr. Whitmore himself or Mrs. Pemberton, and when Marcus made discreet inquiries about visiting the shop to observe its operations, he was politely but firmly informed that Miss Ashworth preferred to conduct her affairs without interference from the shop's former owner. This careful avoidance both wounded his pride and increased his fascination with a woman who seemed immune to the combination of wealth and rank that usually opened every door in society, making him more determined than ever to find some way to breach the barriers she had erected around herself. The irony was not lost on him that his attempt to help her had actually driven her further away, creating the very scandal and awkwardness he had hoped to avoid while failing to achieve any of the closeness he had unconsciously been seeking. News of the Earl of Ravenscroft's extraordinary gift to an unknown woman spread through London society with the speed and destructive power of wildfire, carried from drawing room to drawing room by eager tongues that embellished each retelling until the simple facts became buried beneath layers of speculation and scandal. Within days, every hostess in Mayfair knew the basic outline of the story, though the details varied wildly depending upon the teller's imagination and personal biases regarding the mysterious Miss Ashworth. Some whispered that she must be the Earl's secret mistress, installed in the jewelry shop to provide her with both income and respectability, while allowing him discreet access to her charms. Others, noting the Earl's continued attendance at society functions and his apparent lack of any romantic attachment, speculated that Miss Ashworth might be a secret wife, married in some clandestine ceremony that could not be publicly acknowledged due to her inferior social status. The most charitable interpretation, offered primarily by older ladies who remembered similar arrangements from their youth, was that the Earl had simply taken pity on a deserving woman of reduced circumstances and provided her with the means to support herself respectably, though even these generous souls admitted that the gift was extraordinary enough to raise eyebrows and invite gossip. Lady Margot Sinclair, who had confidently expected to receive the Earl's proposal before the season's end, was among those least inclined toward charitable interpretation, her normally serene composure cracking to reveal a core of cold fury that she struggled to conceal behind her practiced social smile. The possibility that some unknown woman had captured the attention she considered rightfully hers filled Margot with a jealous rage that she channeled into subtle but devastating social warfare, using her position as the season's acknowledged beauty to influence opinion against the upstart Miss Ashworth. At Lady Hartwell's weekly soiree, traditionally one of the most important social gatherings of the week, where reputations were made and destroyed with equal facility, Cordelia found herself the unwilling center of attention as she endured a barrage of pointed questions and barely concealed hostility from women who viewed her with suspicion and envy. Her quiet dignity in the face of such obvious animosity only served to increase the mystique surrounding her, for she refused to offer explanations or justifications that might satisfy the curious, maintaining instead the same reserved composure that had first captured Marcus's attention at the auction house. When Marcus himself arrived at Lady Hartwell's gathering, having been deliberately delayed by business matters that prevented his earlier attendance, the tension in the elegantly appointed drawing room became almost palpable as conversations stopped mid-sentence and all eyes turned to observe his reaction to Miss Ashworth's presence. The Earl, resplendent in evening dress that emphasized his tall frame and commanding presence, seemed unaware of the undercurrents swirling around him as he made his customary rounds of polite conversation. Though those who knew him well might have detected a certain alertness in his manner that suggested he was very much aware of the charged atmosphere. When he finally approached Cordelia, who stood near the tall windows overlooking Lady Hartwell's garden, with Mrs. Pemberton at her side like a faithful guardian, the assembled company held its collective breath in anticipation of what promised to be a most revealing encounter. Their conversation, conducted under the watchful eyes of dozens of eager spectators who strained to catch every nuance of tone and expression, became a masterpiece of verbal fencing that revealed the growing complexity of their relationship, while satisfying none of the onlookers' curiosity about its true nature. "I trust the business suits your needs, Miss Ashworth," Marcus began with the sort of polite inquiry that could be interpreted as either genuine concern or mere social courtesy, his grey eyes studying her face for any sign of the woman who had so boldly challenged him at the auction house. "Your generosity was unexpected, my lord." she replied with the same calm dignity that seemed to characterize all her public utterances, though he caught a subtle emphasis on the word unexpected that suggested criticism rather than gratitude. Perhaps too much so, she added after a slight pause that allowed her words to carry maximum impact. I prefer to think of it as practical investment in capable hands, he responded smoothly, refusing to be drawn into any admission of romantic motivation while attempting to maintain the fiction that his gift had been purely a business decision. And I prefer to think of it as a temporary arrangement, Cordelia countered with quiet firmness, until more suitable ownership can be arranged. Her public rejection of any romantic implications in his gesture delivered with such cool composure that it seemed almost rehearsed, both wounded his pride and increased his fascination with this remarkable woman who continued to confound every expectation he had formed about her character and motivations. The transformation of Whitmore and Associates under Cordelia's stewardship proved nothing short of remarkable, a fact that even the most skeptical observers in London's commercial district could not deny. Within mere weeks of taking control, she had instituted changes that revealed both her natural business acumen and her deep understanding of human nature. Where the previous proprietor had maintained a somewhat stuffy, intimidating atmosphere that catered primarily to established wealthy clientele, Cordelia created an environment of elegant accessibility that drew customers from all levels of society. She rearranged the displays to showcase pieces at various price points together, understanding that a young clerk saving for a simple wedding ring deserved the same courteous attention as a duchess selecting diamonds. Her treatment of the shop's employees underwent a similar revolution as she took time to learn their names, their families' circumstances, and their individual strengths. The elderly craftsman who repaired watches found himself consulted on all manner of timepieces, his expertise finally recognized and valued, while the young apprentice discovered that his suggestions for more modern display techniques were not only heard, but implemented with appropriate credit given. Most remarkably, sales began to increase as word spread through London society that Whitmore and Associates had become an establishment where one could find both quality merchandise and honest dealing, a combination rarer than the finest diamonds in many commercial enterprises. Cordelia's reputation for integrity drew customers who had previously taken their business elsewhere, tired of the inflated prices and condescending attitudes that characterized too many fashionable shops. Her keen eye for quality, developed through years of careful observation and study during her reduced circumstances, allowed her to spot inferior pieces that previous management might have overlooked, while her understanding of customer desires helped her guide patrons toward purchases that truly suited their needs rather than merely their budgets. She possessed an almost uncanny ability to read people, to understand what they sought beyond the obvious, whether it was a nervous young man seeking the perfect ring to propose with, or an aging widow looking for something to remind her of happier times. This gift, combined with her genuine warmth and lack of artifice, created an atmosphere in the shop that was both professional and deeply personal, transforming what had once been merely a place of business into something approaching a sanctuary where people felt comfortable sharing their hopes and dreams along with their purchasing requirements. Marcus found himself drawn to the shop with increasing frequency, ostensibly to check on his investment, but in reality unable to resist observing Cordelia in her element. He would arrive under various pretenses, claiming to inspect the accounts or review inventory, when his true purpose was to watch her interact with customers and employees, marveling at the transformation she had wrought, not only in the physical space, but in the very spirit of the establishment. These visits revealed aspects of both their characters that formal social encounters had kept hidden, stripping away the protective facades they wore in society to expose the genuine individuals beneath. Marcus began to see past Cordelia's defensive pride to the intelligence and warmth that motivated her every action, while she glimpsed the loneliness and genuine concern for others that lay beneath his aristocratic reserve. Their conversations evolved gradually from the formal politeness of their initial meetings to genuine discourse encompassing not only business matters, but literature, philosophy, and their observations about the world around them. She discovered his passionate interest in social reform, his quiet philanthropy that helped veterans of the war find employment, his support of schools for children whose circumstances might otherwise deny them education. He learned of her work with the crossing sweepers near her lodgings, how she shared her meager resources with families even poorer than herself, her ability to find hope and beauty even in the darkest circumstances. One particular afternoon, as he watched her spend considerable time helping an elderly woman select a modest brooch that would serve as a remembrance of her late husband, he found himself compelled to comment on what he observed. "You have a gift for this," he said quietly, gesturing toward the customer who was departing with evident satisfaction, despite having made only a small purchase. Cordelia looked up from the inventory ledger she was updating, her expression thoughtful as she considered his words before responding with the honesty that characterized all their interactions. "I have necessity," she corrected, her tone matter-of-fact rather than bitter. "Gifts are luxuries I cannot afford, my lord." The conversation that followed revealed much about both their philosophies, as Marcus argued that necessity often revealed gifts that might otherwise remain hidden, while Cordelia maintained that survival required practical skills rather than innate talents. Yet even as they debated, both recognized the deeper truth that her success stemmed from a combination of natural ability and hard-won experience, shaped by circumstances that had taught her to value substance over appearance and genuine caring over mere politeness. The delicate balance of trust and mutual respect that had begun to develop between Marcus and Cordelia faced its first serious threat when Mr. Reginald Ashworth arrived in London, having heard through the network of gossip and speculation that connected even the most distant social circles that his daughter had somehow acquired valuable connections. Reginald represented everything weak and destructive about the aristocratic class that Marcus occasionally encountered but generally managed to avoid, a man whose charm and good looks had once made him welcome in the finest houses, but whose gambling addiction and moral weakness had systematically destroyed everything he touched. At 52, he retained traces of the handsome man he had been, though dissipation had marked his features with telltale signs of excess, and his manner still carried the easy confidence that had once made him popular among his peers. Yet beneath this surface appeal lay the desperate cunning of a man who had long since lost any sense of honor or responsibility, viewing every relationship and every situation purely in terms of what advantage it might provide for his next wager or scheme. His very presence in London represented a threat to the careful rebuilding of Cordelia's life, reminding her of the betrayals and disappointments that had shaped her defensive nature while simultaneously placing her in an impossible position regarding her relationship with Marcus. Reginald alternated between tearful pleas for forgiveness and financial assistance, and barely veiled hints about arrangements he might be able to facilitate between his daughter and her wealthy benefactor, his suggestions carrying implications that made Cordelia's skin crawl with revulsion and shame. His appearance at the shop created immediate tension among the employees, who had grown protective of their transformed workplace and its principled owner, while his attempts to establish himself in her modest lodgings brought back memories of the fear and uncertainty that had dominated her adolescence. Most painful of all was the way his presence reminded her of why she had learned not to trust easily, why every gesture of kindness or generosity carried the potential for devastating disappointment, and why accepting Marcus's extraordinary gift might have been a mistake that would ultimately destroy the peace and security she had worked so hard to create. The very sight of her father brought back vivid memories of that terrible day 11 years ago when he had casually announced the sale of her grandmother's necklace as though it were merely another asset to be liquidated, showing no understanding or concern for the emotional significance of the piece to his grieving daughter. Now, watching him eye the shop's inventory with the calculating gaze of a man assessing potential profit, Cordelia felt the walls she had so carefully constructed around her heart beginning to rebuild themselves, threatening to shut out not only her father's destructive influence, but also the tentative warmth she had begun to feel toward the man whose generosity had made her current happiness possible. Meanwhile, Lady Margot Sinclair had not remained idle in the face of what she perceived as a direct challenge to her position as Marcus's intended bride, and her campaign to reclaim his attention had escalated into open warfare against Cordelia's reputation and character. Armed with the weapons of social influence and carefully cultivated connections, Lady Margot began spreading rumors that grew more vicious with each retelling, suggesting that Cordelia's acquisition of the jewelry establishment had come at a price that no respectable woman should be willing to pay. She whispered to her circle of friends about the impropriety of a gentleman giving such an extravagant gift to an unmarried woman of questionable background, implying that their association was far more intimate than either party had acknowledged publicly. Her suggestions, delivered with the practiced skill of a woman who had mastered the art of character assassination while maintaining plausible deniability, painted Cordelia as an adventuress who had somehow manipulated the Earl's sympathies for her own financial gain. The rumors spread through London society with the speed and destructiveness of wildfire, carried by those who found malicious gossip more entertaining than truth, and repeated by others who simply accepted such stories without question. Lady Margot's position as an acknowledged leader of fashionable society gave her words additional weight, while her beauty and connections provided protection from any direct challenge to her behavior. She took particular pleasure in suggesting that Marcus's interest in social reform had made him vulnerable to the sob stories of designing females who preyed upon masculine sympathy for their own advancement, a characterization that transformed his genuine kindness into evidence of foolish gullibility while simultaneously attacking Cordelia's integrity and independence. The cumulative effect of this sustained assault on her reputation created an atmosphere of suspicion and speculation that threatened to undermine everything Cordelia had worked to build, as potential customers began to question whether they wished to associate with an establishment whose proprietress had become the subject of such scandalous gossip, while society matrons who had initially been impressed by her business acumen now wondered whether her success had been achieved through means they could not publicly acknowledge. The morning of what would become known in certain circles as the Ashworth incident began peacefully enough, with Cordelia arriving at the shop early to review inventory before the day's customers arrived. The autumn light filtering through the tall windows cast the displayed jewelry in particularly lovely relief, and she had been looking forward to a quiet day of routine business punctuated by the arrival of a new shipment from one of their most talented craftsmen. However, her tranquility was shattered shortly after 10 o'clock, when the shop's front door burst open with such violence that the delicate chimes above it jangled discordantly, admitting 3 rough-looking men whose appearance and manner immediately announced their unwelcome purpose. The leader of this unwholesome trio was a man of middle years with the scarred hands and calculating eyes of someone accustomed to collecting debts through intimidation rather than legal process, while his companions possessed the sort of deliberately menacing demeanor that suggested violence was never far from their thoughts. Mr. Ashworth's gambling debts, which had been accumulating during his weeks in London like storm clouds gathering before a tempest, had finally reached the attention of creditors whose patience had been exhausted and whose methods of collection made no allowance for social niceties or public propriety. The lead creditor, a man who introduced himself simply as Thompson without offering any courtesy title, wasted no time in explaining their presence with a bluntness that made several customers gasp in shock and horror. "We're here about your father's debts, Miss Ashworth," he announced in a voice that carried clearly through the suddenly silent shop, his words designed to create maximum embarrassment and pressure. "Mr. Reginald Ashworth owes us £400, and since he's told us his daughter has come into good fortune through her connection with a certain earl, we've come to collect from the family what the gentleman himself cannot pay." The implications of his statement struck Cordelia like physical blows, as she realized that her father had not only continued gambling during his stay in London, but had used her name and supposed relationship with Marcus as collateral for his debts. The presence of these men in her shop, with their crude manner and threatening implications, represented exactly the kind of public spectacle she had worked so desperately to avoid, threatening to destroy in minutes the reputation for respectability and integrity she had spent months building through careful attention to every detail of her conduct and business practices. Cordelia's first instinct was to protect her employees and the innocent customers who had been caught in this mortifying scene, her mind racing through possible responses while maintaining the dignified composure that had become second nature during years of navigating difficult circumstances with limited resources. "I'm afraid there has been some misunderstanding, gentlemen," she said with as much calm authority as she could muster, though her heart was pounding with a mixture of humiliation and growing anger at her father's betrayal. "My father's debts are his own responsibility, not mine, and I have no legal or moral obligation to settle them on his behalf." Her words, delivered with quiet firmness despite the tremor she fought to keep from her voice, only seemed to amuse Thompson and his companions, who clearly had no intention of leaving empty-handed regardless of legal niceties or social conventions. The second man, whose broken nose and scarred knuckles suggested a history of physical confrontation, stepped forward with a smile that held no warmth whatsoever as he replied, "That may be true in the eyes of the law, miss, but family obligations run deeper than legal requirements, and we have it on good authority that you've recently come into considerable resources through your friendship with a certain gentleman of rank." The emphasis he placed on the word friendship carried implications that made Cordelia's cheeks burn with shame and fury, as she realized that her father had not only used her name to secure credit, but had also spread gossip about her relationship with Marcus that painted her in the worst possible light. The situation deteriorated further when Thompson gestured toward the valuable inventory surrounding them and observed with calculated menace, "We're not unreasonable men, Miss Ashworth. If you cannot pay in coin, perhaps some of these pretty baubles might serve as partial payment, since we understand they're not truly yours anyway, but belong to your generous protector." The suggestion that she might be forced to surrender the shop's merchandise to pay her father's gambling debts while enduring these men's crude insinuations about her character pushed Cordelia beyond the limits of her patience, and she drew herself up to her full height with a dignity that would have made her grandmother proud as she prepared to defend herself and her business against these unwelcome intruders. The confrontation might have escalated into something truly ugly had not Marcus chosen that precise moment to enter the shop, his arrival as timely as it was unexpected. He had come, as he often did, under the pretense of checking on his investment, though his true motivation was the simple pleasure of observing Cordelia in her element and perhaps engaging in one of their increasingly meaningful conversations. However, the scene that greeted him required no explanation, as years of managing his various estates had made him familiar with the type of men who collected debts through intimidation, and the particular brand of menace they brought to their unpleasant profession. Without hesitation or apparent concern for the implications of his actions, Marcus stepped forward with the commanding presence that had served him well in business negotiations and social situations alike, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Gentlemen," he said with deceptive mildness, though his grey eyes had taken on a steely quality that suggested consequences for anyone foolish enough to test his patience, I believe you have business with me rather than with Miss Ashworth." The sudden transformation in the creditor's manner was both immediate and telling, as Thompson and his companions recognized the voice of true power when they heard it, and understood that they were now dealing with someone whose influence could make their lives considerably more difficult if they chose to pursue their current course of action. Marcus continued with the same calm authority that had characterized his most successful business dealings, his words carefully chosen to resolve the situation while minimizing further embarrassment to Cordelia, though he could see the cost of this public scene in the rigid set of her shoulders and the flush of humiliation staining her cheeks. Mr. Ashworth's debts are indeed family matters, and as such should be settled privately rather than disrupting legitimate business operations. If you will be so good as to provide me with the exact figures, I shall arrange immediate payment in exchange for your agreement that this matter is concluded and that neither Mr. Ashworth nor his family will be troubled further regarding these particular obligations. The speed with which the transaction was completed revealed both the creditors' eagerness to collect their money and their relief at avoiding potential complications with someone of Marcus's rank and influence. But even as Thompson counted the notes Marcus had produced from his coat and offered grudging thanks for his lordship's intervention, the damage to Cordelia's carefully constructed reputation had already been done. The aftermath of this very public display of Marcus's protection proved even more devastating than the original confrontation, as the presence of numerous witnesses ensured that news of the incident spread through London society with the speed of wildfire carrying fresh fuel for scandal. Within hours, every drawing room in Mayfair buzzed with speculation about the exact nature of the relationship between the Earl and the mysterious Miss Ashworth, and the fact that he had settled her father's gambling debts in such a dramatically public manner was interpreted by society as confirmation of their most salacious suspicions. Lady Margot Sinclair, upon hearing the news, could barely contain her triumph as she realized that her enemy had finally provided ammunition that could destroy any pretense of respectability, and she wasted no time in ensuring that every influential hostess in London understood the true significance of what had occurred at Whitmore and Associates. The consensus among the fashionable world was swift and brutal in its judgment. No gentleman settled such debts for a woman unless she was providing services that went far beyond mere business partnership, and Miss Ashworth's protestations of innocence would only make her appear more calculating in her deception. Even those who had initially been inclined to give Cordelia the benefit of the doubt found themselves questioning her character, for Marcus's intervention had been so immediate and comprehensive that it suggested a degree of intimacy and obligation that proper society could not openly acknowledge. The scandal threatened not only Cordelia's personal reputation, but also the success of the business she had worked so hard to build, as customers who had been drawn by her integrity now wondered whether they wished to be associated with an establishment whose proprietress had become the subject of such widespread gossip and speculation. The cruelest irony was that Marcus's generous intention to protect her from embarrassment had actually created far greater damage than allowing her to face the creditors alone, demonstrating the impossible position in which society placed women who dared to operate outside its rigid expectations and the devastating consequences that could result from even the most well-meaning masculine intervention. That evening, in the privacy of the shop after the last employee had departed and the doors had been locked against further intrusion, Cordelia and Marcus finally engaged in the kind of completely honest conversation that their growing friendship had been building toward, but which circumstances had previously prevented. The events of the day had stripped away the last vestiges of formal politeness between them, leaving them free to speak with the kind of directness that their deepest feelings demanded, but that social convention usually prohibited. Cordelia began by explaining the true significance of her grandmother's necklace, her voice soft with memory as she described the woman who had been her anchor during childhood, and the devastating impact of its loss when her father's gambling had reached its inevitable crisis. "I saved for 5 years to reclaim it," she told him. Her hands clasped tightly in her lap as she struggled to convey the depth of her attachment to what others might dismiss as mere jewelry. Not for its monetary value, though that was considerable, but because it held every memory of love I possessed, every moment of security and acceptance I had ever known. The necklace represented my grandmother's strength, her dignity in the face of adversity, and her belief that a woman could maintain her principles regardless of circumstances. When my father sold it, I felt as though he had sold my very soul, my last connection to someone who had loved me unconditionally and believed in my worth as a person rather than viewing me as merely another asset to be disposed of when convenient. Marcus listened to her confession with growing understanding and a pain in his chest that he had never experienced before, realizing that her fierce independence and defensive pride stemmed not from arrogance, but from the deep wounds inflicted by those who should have protected her. In return, he found himself revealing his own loneliness and the isolation that his wealth and rank had created, admitting that his suspicion of others' motives had made genuine connection nearly impossible until he met someone who wanted something money could not buy. "When you outbid me that day," he said quietly, his grey eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You wanted something that no amount of gold could purchase. I had forgotten such things existed, forgotten that there were people in the world who valued love and memory over material advantage. Their first kiss, when it came, felt like the natural culmination of weeks of growing understanding and trust, tender rather than passionate, born of mutual recognition and respect rather than mere physical attraction. Sealing a bond that had been forming slowly but inexorably since that first day at the auction house, when two proud, lonely people had discovered in each other something they had never dared hope to find. The days following their tender confession and first kiss should have marked the beginning of a new chapter in both Marcus and Cordelia's lives. Yet instead they found themselves confronting obstacles that seemed to grow more insurmountable with each passing hour. The scandal created by her father's creditors had taken on a life of its own, spreading through London society with the devastating efficiency of plague, carrying whispers and insinuations that transformed their innocent friendship into something sordid and calculating. Marcus discovered that his usual social circles now regarded him with a mixture of amusement and disapproval, as though his association with a woman of questionable reputation reflected poorly on his judgment and character. The gentlemen at his club made pointed remarks about men who allowed themselves to be manipulated by designing females, while the ladies of society treated him with the sort of knowing looks that suggested they understood perfectly well what services Miss Ashworth must be providing in exchange for his protection. Even more troubling were the political consequences that began to emerge, as Lady Margot's family possessed connections and influence that extended far beyond mere social standing. Her father, the Duke of Thornfield, had made it quietly but firmly known that Marcus's continued association with the notorious Miss Ashworth would result in the withdrawal of support for various reform measures that Marcus had championed in Parliament, effectively threatening to destroy years of careful work on behalf of veterans and working families. The Duke's message was delivered with the polished subtlety that marked all aristocratic coercion, couched in terms of regret and disappointment rather than direct threats. Yet the implications were unmistakable. Lady Margot herself played her part with calculated precision, appearing at social functions with an air of wounded dignity that suggested she was nobly enduring public humiliation while maintaining hope that the man she loved would eventually see reason and return to his proper place in society. Her performance was masterful in its restraint, never directly criticizing Marcus or his choices, but allowing her hurt to show just enough that observers felt compelled to take sides in what they perceived as a battle between virtue and vice, respectability and scandal. The pressure mounted steadily as influential voices began suggesting that a man in Marcus's position had obligations that transcended personal preference, that his duty to his name and his role in society required him to make choices based on broader considerations than mere romantic inclination. The irony was not lost on him that his attempt to help Cordelia had instead trapped them both in a web of expectations and consequences that threatened to destroy any possibility of happiness for either of them. For Cordelia, the situation proved even more devastating as she watched the business she had worked so hard to build begin to suffer from the scandal attached to her name. Customers who had once sought out Whitmore and Associates for its reputation of integrity now whispered among themselves about whether they wished to be seen patronizing an establishment owned by a woman of questionable virtue, while the employees she cared about faced the humiliation of working for someone who had become a subject of scandalous gossip throughout fashionable London. Most painful of all was the knowledge that her father's presence in the city guaranteed that this would not be the last such incident, that his weakness and lack of scruples would continue creating situations that reflected poorly on her character and damaged the careful reputation she had struggled to build. Reginald's response to the settlement of his debts had been typical of his selfish nature, expressing gratitude that lasted only long enough for him to begin calculating how he might leverage his daughter's supposed relationship with the Earl for additional advantage. Within days of the confrontation at the shop, he was already hinting to his gambling companions about his family's connections, creating new debts based on the assumption that Marcus's intervention had established a precedent for future assistance. So, the cycle seemed destined to repeat itself endlessly, with each incident creating fresh scandal and deeper damage to Cordelia's position until she would become completely unmarriageable and unemployable, a cautionary tale about the dangers of accepting charity from men whose motives could never be entirely pure. The weight of this realization settled upon her with crushing finality as she understood that her presence in London had become toxic not only to her own prospects, but also to Marcus's future and to the livelihoods of the innocent people who depended upon the shop for their survival. The choice that confronted her was agonizing in its clarity. She could fight to remain and watch everything she cared about be systematically destroyed by forces beyond her control, or she could sacrifice her own happiness to preserve what remained of Marcus's reputation and her employees' security. In a moment of painful clarity that seemed to crystallize all her fears and hopes into a single, unavoidable decision, Cordelia resolved to leave London entirely, removing herself from the situation before further damage could be done to anyone she cared about. The decision required every ounce of strength and determination she possessed, for it meant abandoning not only the business she had come to love, but also the first genuine happiness she had known since her grandmother's death. Yet she could see no alternative that did not involve watching Marcus's political career and social standing be destroyed by his association with her, or seeing the employees of Whitmore and Associates suffer continued embarrassment and potential loss of employment due to their connection with a scandalous proprietress. With the same methodical precision that had characterized her approach to business, she began making arrangements that would ensure the least possible disruption to others while securing her own departure from a situation that had become impossible to maintain. Her first step was to approach Mr. Whitmore privately, explaining that circumstances had made it necessary for her to withdraw from management of the establishment and offering to sell her interest back to him at a fraction of its true value. The elderly jeweler, who had grown genuinely fond of Cordelia during their brief partnership and had witnessed firsthand the improvements she had brought to his business, protested vigorously against what he considered an unnecessary sacrifice. "Miss Ashworth," he said with evident distress. "Surely there must be some other solution to these temporary difficulties, for you have proven yourself invaluable to this establishment, and it would be a tragedy to lose your guidance over mere gossip and scandal." However, Cordelia's resolve remained unshakable as she explained that the gossip and scandal would continue as long as she remained, potentially destroying not only the shop's reputation, but also the livelihoods of everyone connected with it. Her only condition for the sale was that Mr. Whitmore guarantee employment security for all current staff, a requirement that he readily accepted given his genuine appreciation for the team she had assembled and trained. The transaction was completed within 2 days, providing Cordelia with sufficient funds to establish herself somewhere far from London, perhaps as a governess in a remote household where her notoriety could not follow her, or as a companion to an elderly lady who valued discretion over fashion. The money would not provide luxury, but it would ensure independence and the possibility of building a new life based on her own efforts rather than the charity of others, no matter how well-intentioned that charity might be. The letter Cordelia wrote to Marcus proved to be one of the most difficult tasks she had ever undertaken, for she needed to explain her departure without revealing the depth of her feelings or the pain that her decision was causing her. Every word required careful consideration, as she sought to convey gratitude for his kindness, while making it clear that she could not accept what she viewed as excessive generosity that came at too high a cost to his own position and prospects. "My lord," she began, her hand trembling slightly as she formed the words that would sever the connection that had become so precious to her. "Your generosity has been extraordinary, but I cannot accept what I cannot repay." The formality of the opening was deliberate, designed to create distance between them and to emphasize that she viewed their relationship in purely business terms, though every fiber of her being rebelled against such coldness toward the man she had come to love. She continued with equal care, explaining that while their friendship had been a source of great happiness to her, she could not bear to be the cause of scandal that might damage his position in society or interfere with the political work that meant so much to him. "The gift of your friendship has been precious to me," she wrote, allowing herself this one admission of genuine feeling. "But I will not be the cause of scandal that damages your position or prospects." These words represented the closest she dared come to acknowledging the love that had grown between them, for to be more explicit would have made her departure even more difficult and might have tempted him to pursue her with arguments she was not certain she could resist. Her closing was deliberately formal and final, designed to discourage any attempt at following her or changing her mind. "I return your investment with gratitude and hope you will remember our acquaintance with kindness rather than regret. Your servant, Cordelia Ashworth." The signature, with its emphasis on her role as his servant rather than his equal, was calculated to wound him just enough that anger might override any inclination to pursue her, though writing those words felt like cutting out her own heart. She sealed the letter with hands that shook despite her determination, knowing that once it was delivered, there would be no turning back from the course she had chosen. Cordelia's departure from London took place in the grey pre-dawn hours when the city's streets were empty, save for the occasional night watchman and the early vendors beginning their daily routines. She had deliberately chosen this time to avoid any possibility of encountering Marcus or being seen by acquaintances who might try to dissuade her from her chosen course, carrying with her only a single traveling bag containing her most essential possessions and the small wooden box that held her grandmother's necklace. The weight of that precious jewelry seemed symbolic of everything she was leaving behind, the connections and hopes that had briefly made her believe in the possibility of happiness, despite the obstacles that had always defined her life. As her hired coach rolled through the sleeping streets toward the coaching inn, where she would begin her journey to an uncertain destination in the North Country, Cordelia forced herself not to look back toward the shop that had represented such triumph and joy, or toward the fashionable districts where Marcus might, at that very moment, be sleeping peacefully, unaware that she was removing herself from his life forever. The letter she had left would not be discovered until later that morning, when Mrs. Pemberton arrived at their lodgings to find Cordelia's few remaining belongings neatly packed, and a brief note explaining that urgent family business required her immediate departure from London. By the time Marcus learned of her departure, reading her carefully composed explanation with growing horror and disbelief, Cordelia would be many miles away and completely beyond his reach, having sacrificed her own happiness in the hope that distance might restore his reputation and allow him to fulfill the social obligations that his position demanded. The irony that her noble gesture would cause him far greater pain than any scandal could have inflicted was lost on Cordelia in her determination to do what she believed was right, leaving Marcus to face the devastating realization that the woman he had come to love had chosen to protect his interests even at the cost of her own dreams and their shared future. Marcus's reaction to discovering Cordelia's departure shocked even his closest associates, who had never witnessed such complete abandonment of social obligations and aristocratic composure in a man they had considered the epitome of controlled dignity. When his secretary arrived that morning with Cordelia's letter, expecting to find his employer conducting business as usual in his elegantly appointed study, he instead encountered a man transformed by grief and desperate determination. The carefully measured tones that had characterized Marcus's every interaction since childhood gave way to urgent commands as he barked orders for his fastest horse to be saddled immediately, his traveling clothes to be packed, and inquiries to be made at every coaching inn within a day's ride of London. The transformation was so complete that James, his long-time valet, ventured the unprecedented step of suggesting that perhaps his lordship might wish to consider the wisdom of such precipitous action, only to be met with a look that brooked no argument or delay. "I care nothing for wisdom at this moment, James," Marcus declared, with an intensity that made the older man step back in surprise. "My concern is for the woman I loved, who has sacrificed her own happiness under the mistaken belief that she is protecting mine." The household had never seen their master in such a state, abandoning the measured deliberation that had marked his every decision in favor of action driven by pure emotion and the terrible fear that he might lose forever the one person who had made his privileged but lonely existence meaningful. Within 2 hours of reading Cordelia's letter, he was mounted on his finest stallion and racing through the streets of London with a desperation that scattered pedestrians and drew curious stares from those who recognized the usually composed Earl of Ravenscroft, pursuing some unknown quarry with the single-minded focus of a man whose entire future hung in the balance. His pursuit took him through a series of coaching inns and countryside villages. Following a trail of discreet inquiries and half-remembered descriptions from innkeepers and ostlers, who recalled a quietly dressed young woman traveling alone toward the northern counties. Each dead end and false lead only intensified his determination, as he realized how effectively Cordelia had planned her disappearance and how completely she had committed herself to removing every trace of her presence from his life. The irony that her very efficiency in executing her plan only demonstrated once again the qualities that had made him fall in love with her was not lost on Marcus, even as he pushed himself and his horse to their limits in an effort to bridge the growing distance between them. On the third day of his relentless pursuit, Marcus finally received the information he had been desperately seeking from a helpful ostler at a coaching inn in Kent, who remembered a young lady matching Cordelia's description, inquiring about employment opportunities in the area. The man's casual mention that she had taken lodgings at the Crown and Anchor in the nearby village of Ashford, while seeking a position as governess, sent Marcus racing through the countryside with renewed hope, his heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and dread as he wondered whether he would find her still there, or whether she had already moved on to an even more remote location. The village of Ashford proved to be a modest settlement, clustered around an ancient church and marketplace, the sort of place where a woman seeking to disappear might hope to find anonymity and peace, far removed from the gossip and scandal that had driven her from London. The Crown and Anchor occupied a prominent position on the main street, its Tudor facade speaking of centuries of hospitality to travellers, and as Marcus dismounted before its entrance, he felt a moment of uncertainty about how Cordelia might receive his unexpected arrival after she had gone to such lengths to ensure their separation. The innkeeper, a jovial man named Henderson, who clearly took pride in his establishment's reputation for comfort and discretion, confirmed that a Miss Ashworth was indeed staying at his inn, though he added with protective concern that the young lady seemed quite determined to maintain her privacy and had expressed no desire for visitors. When Marcus identified himself and requested an immediate meeting with Miss Ashworth, Henderson's manner shifted to one of respectful deference, though his protective instincts regarding his guest remained evident, as he agreed to carry the message while suggesting that his lordship might prefer to wait in the inn's private parlour rather than conducting such a potentially emotional reunion in the public tap-room. The few minutes that passed while Henderson climbed the narrow stairs to Cordelia's chamber seemed to stretch into eternity for Marcus, who found himself pacing the small parlour like a caged animal while rehearsing and discarding various approaches to the conversation that would determine both their futures. When Cordelia finally appeared in the doorway of the parlour, her face pale but composed despite the obvious shock of seeing Marcus in such an unlikely setting, the words he had carefully prepared during his frantic journey abandoned him entirely. She looked smaller somehow in this modest country inn, wearing a simple dress that emphasized her reduced circumstances, yet her dignity remained undiminished by the humble surroundings or the awkwardness of their unexpected reunion. The silence stretched between them for several heartbeats as they studied each other across the small room, both acutely aware that this conversation would resolve nothing or everything, that there could be no middle ground between the complete separation she had sought and the reconciliation he desperately hoped to achieve. "Did you think I would simply let you disappear?" he finally asked, his voice carrying all the pain and bewilderment of the past 3 days, though he fought to keep any note of accusation from his tone. Her response came softly, but with the same unwavering conviction that had characterized her departure. "I thought you would understand the necessity, my lord," though the tears gathering in her eyes betrayed the cost of maintaining such resolve. The formal address stung him more than any rebuke could have, representing as it did her attempt to rebuild the barriers between them that their growing intimacy had gradually dissolved, yet he could see in her expression that the distance she was trying to create caused her as much pain as it did him. "The only necessity I understand," he replied with quiet intensity, stepping closer despite her obvious desire to maintain physical as well as emotional distance, "is that I cannot live without you, Cordelia." The use of her given name was deliberate, a reminder of the intimacy they had shared and a rejection of the formality she was attempting to impose, and he watched as his words struck her with almost physical force, causing her carefully maintained composure to waver for the first time since she had entered the room. The conversation that followed stripped away the last vestiges of pretense between them as they finally confronted the true nature of their feelings and the obstacles that had driven them apart. Cordelia explained once again her certainty that their association would destroy his political career and social standing, while Marcus countered with passionate arguments that such considerations meant nothing compared to the happiness they had found together. When she pointed out that scandal would follow them wherever they went, making it impossible for him to pursue the reform work that gave his life meaning, he surprised her by revealing that he had already begun making arrangements to step back from his parliamentary duties in favor of other forms of philanthropy that would not require the approval of society matrons and political allies. "I have discovered," he told her with a rueful smile, "that there are many ways to help people that do not require maintaining perfect social standing or pandering to the prejudices of those who view charity as a form of entertainment." His willingness to sacrifice his political ambitions for their relationship moved Cordelia deeply, yet she remained troubled by the thought that he might come to resent such sacrifices in years to come, that the love which seemed so strong now might not survive the reality of social exile and professional disappointment. It was only when Marcus took her hands and spoke with complete honesty about the emptiness of his life before meeting her, the way his wealth and position had become meaningless privileges that brought no real satisfaction, that she began to understand how thoroughly her presence had changed his perspective on everything he had previously valued. The recognition that they had each found in the other not just love, but purpose, not just companionship, but a shared vision of how their lives might be made meaningful, finally broke down the last of her resistance to the future he was offering. Marcus's proposal, when it finally came, was unlike anything Cordelia might have imagined during those brief moments in her youth when she had allowed herself to dream of marriage and happiness. There was no formality or ceremony, no carefully rehearsed speech about honor and duty, but instead a raw honesty that reflected the unconventional nature of their entire relationship. "I care nothing for society's expectations," he said, his gray eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Marry me, Cordelia, not because of scandal or convenience, but because life without you is meaningless wealth and empty privilege, and because together we can create something far more valuable than either of us could achieve alone." Her acceptance, when it came, carried conditions that revealed how thoroughly she had thought about the implications of becoming his countess and the opportunities such a position might create for meaningful work. "I will not be a society wife who ignores the struggles of others while enjoying the privileges of rank," she told him firmly, meeting his gaze with the same directness that had first captured his attention at the auction house. "If I become a countess, I will use that position to help people like my former employees to create opportunities for women who have been denied education and independence, to ensure that our wealth serves purposes beyond our own comfort and pleasure." Marcus's agreement came without hesitation, for he had already recognized that Cordelia's passionate concern for others was one of the qualities he most admired about her, and the prospect of joining their resources and influence in service of causes they both believed in filled him with excitement rather than apprehension. Their engagement, announced upon their return to London, initially shocked society with its apparent disregard for conventional expectations, yet their obvious devotion to each other and their immediate involvement in charitable endeavors gradually won over even some of their harshest critics, creating a new model of aristocratic marriage based on genuine partnership rather than mere social alliance. 6 months after their wedding, which had been conducted in a small ceremony attended only by their closest friends and the employees of Whitmore and Associates, who had become like family to them both, Cordelia stood in the renovated and expanded jewelry establishment that had become the centerpiece of their philanthropic efforts. The shop now served multiple purposes, maintaining its reputation for fine jewelry while also functioning as a training center where young women of limited means could learn the skills necessary to support themselves in commerce, and as a meeting place for various charitable organizations that focused on improving conditions for working families throughout London. Around her neck gleamed her grandmother's necklace, no longer a symbol of loss and betrayal, but of love reclaimed and properly honored. While the new workshop in the building's rear hummed with activity as skilled craftsmen worked alongside eager apprentices learning trades that would provide them with independence and security, Marcus watched their enterprise with evident pride, having discovered that his wealth finally had purpose when used to create genuine opportunities for others, rather than merely maintaining the comfortable status quo that had characterized his previous existence. Their love story, which had begun with a collision of wills over a piece of jewelry at an elegant auction house, had flourished through understanding, sacrifice, and the gradual recognition that true partnership required not just passion, but shared commitment to making their privileged position serve purposes beyond their own happiness. In the final scene of their remarkable journey together, as they prepared to leave the shop for an evening's entertainment at the home of friends who had come to appreciate their unconventional but effective approach to social responsibility, Marcus fastened around Cordelia's neck a new creation made especially for her by their most talented craftsman, a delicate arrangement of diamonds and sapphires that caught the light with breathtaking beauty. "Do you ever regret outbidding me that day?" he asked with the gentle teasing that had become characteristic of their private moments together. To which she replied with a smile that held all the warmth and contentment of a woman who had found not just love, but purpose. "Never, though I must admit your response was rather excessive. I prefer to think of it as appropriately dramatic." He laughed, kissing her neck softly in the spot where the new necklace rested against her skin. After all, how else does one win the heart of a woman who values love over diamonds and who transforms every gift into an opportunity to serve others?